Thank you for joining us for the Town of Burlington Fiscal 2022 Budget Overview. Before we start, I just want to thank our residents, our elected and appointed officials, and our employees for your patience, your kindness, and your civility toward one another during this very difficult year for all of us. I'm really proud of how the community responded to all the crises we have faced, and I'm extremely optimistic for our future. Despite my optimism, we still have quite a bit of work to do to get back on our feet financially, and that is reflected in the budget we are presenting to you now. Okay, the first slide here we have is an illustration of the many steps in the budget process. The starting point is at about 12 o'clock in the diagram. This is the guideline setting discussion that starts in the fall. That discussion is a collaboration between elected officials, the town and school finance teams, and the Ways and Means Committee. We discuss the overall needs for funding as well as the financial constraints that we are working under. We do our best to reach a consensus, and as an end result, all parties typically walk away a little bit unhappy, which I take to be a sign that the guidelines are, for the most part, fair and balanced. We are presently approximately 4:30 in the diagram, which is where you will be asked to raise and appropriate funding for our departmental budgets. As you are doing so, you should know that these budgets have been thoroughly reviewed on several different levels along the way. A department first has to present its budget to its supervisory authority. So for DPW, that would be reviewed by the select board and the administration, or for example, the library would seek approval from the library trustees. The next level of review is by a Ways and Means subcommittee, which are smaller teams that go through each budget line by line. A lot of questions are answered and modifications made during the subcommittee discussions. When that part is complete, the subcommittee then presents the department's budget to the full Ways and Means Committee for another round of discussion. Upon a successful vote at Ways and Means, it is presented to town meeting as part of the operating budget that you will be considering now. Once the budget is finalized, the select board needs to determine the local total amount of tax dollars that we need to be raised and how to distribute them over the various classes of property in town at a public hearing on the tax rate in the fall. From here, we prepare various documentation of all these formal processes to be submitted to the state for approval. Once approval is received, the town's tax department can prepare the actual bills for mailing. Fiscal 21 budget recap. Since last year was such an unusual year, we thought it made sense to do a quick recap as to how things went for the current fiscal year ending June 30th, 2021. Unlike a typical budget year where we address the budget entirely in May, we asked you and you provided us with the ability to pass a budget and then return to town meeting in September with any adjustments that we may require to balance the budget. And we did in fact return in September with 2.1 million worth of reductions, primarily focused on our shared costs, but also impacting the town and school operating budgets to the tune of approximately $350,000 each. I believe that the difficult decisions we made in September have put the town on solid footing as we begin the process of recovering from the pandemic. Fiscal 22 is still a difficult budget year for us, but was made a lot easier due to the adjustments we made in September. I am very optimistic that the fiscal 22 budget as proposed will not require an additional adjustment, but we will need to continue to keep our eye on key economic indicators throughout the summer. Fiscal 22 guidelines. This next slide summarizes our budget guideline discussions for this budget. As a reminder, here in Burlington, no one party controls the guidelines. We get together and collaborate on a framework so that we can present a unified, all-encompassing budget to town meeting. The way our government is structured, if we are unable to get on the same page, town meeting could be faced with multiple budgets to consider. For example, one from the school department, one from the town departments, and a separate one from Ways and Means Committee. Imagine for a second the chaos that would cause for all of us at town meeting. So the setting of guidelines is not a perfect process, but it certainly beats the alternative. We start off with the administration proposing the first set of guidelines for discussion, which is shown on the top line of this chart. The two key areas of discussion we talked about was that the 3% blended operating budget would be a little bit too restrictive on departments. It would make it very difficult to maintain services. We also talked a lot about our desire to minimize the impact of the tax levy increase. We felt that the 5.5% increase from the previous year was higher than where we want to be, and we worked together to move that percentage down. After a robust discussion, the group voted the guidelines in the middle row. A limit of 5.25% on accommodated accounts, a blended 3.5% operating budget that got departments a little bit closer to maintaining services, and a 4.9% tax levy increase, which met the desire of the group to back off a bit on the tax levy. We are happy to report that we essentially met these guidelines within 1/100th of a percentage or so. This next slide gives us an overview of our revenues and expenditures in different categories. On the revenue side, you can see that commercial taxes cover about half of the entire budget. You will not see that in too many communities in Massachusetts. The next largest category is residential taxes at 31%, followed up by local receipts at 9% and state aid at 6%. On the expenditure side, there are no real surprises. Education expenditures are the largest percentage, as they are in all communities, followed closely by our accommodated accounts, which essentially represent our shared costs not attributed to individual departments, such as employee benefits, pension, property and casualty insurance. There are also several budgets in this category that have been pulled out of departmental operating budgets for guideline setting purposes, as if we included them under operating budget guidelines, we would create an unfair burden to those departments. An example of these would be trash and recycling budget, as well as school department, special education, tuitions, and transportation. General government comes in at approximately 25%, and we have a couple of other small categories that represent the assessor's overlay and the deficit account created by snow and ice removal. We will now talk in a little bit more detail on the three major components of revenue. As a reminder, tax levy funds about 81% of our budget, local receipts approximately 9%, and state aid comes in at 6%. Property taxes. This chart indicates how much we have had to increase our tax levy annually to fund our budgetary needs. By definition, the tax levy is a total of all property tax bills levied in the town, residential, commercial, and personal. As a member of the administration, I can tell you that we are under constant pressure from the select board to maintain modest tax levy increases. As you saw in the first slide, the board is responsible for setting a tax rate to support this budget next November, long after the work we have done here at the Maytown meeting. As a result of that, they receive most of the angry calls from residents who are unhappy about tax increases. For fiscal year 2022, we are proposing that we raise the tax levy by 4.92%, which is less than in the last two fiscal years. We will talk more about this on some future slides, but this chart also highlights that important relationship between commercial and residential taxes and the shift where commercial taxes pick up a larger share of the tax levy. As you can see in each individual year on the chart, the impact of the levy increase on the average single-family home in town is always less, and that is due to the shifting of tax burden from the residential to the commercial classes. Historically, our residential rate is very competitive statewide, coming in 44th lowest out of 351 communities in Massachusetts last year. It is important to note that many of the communities with lower rates than us in this survey are smaller communities that don't provide much in terms of services. For example, Chilmark, or many of the smaller towns in Western Mass. I would say that we are in the top 10 or 15th lowest in the state when compared to communities that actually provide similar services to their residents. On the commercial side, our rate is on the higher end, but keep in mind that only a small group of communities in the state actually have a commercial tax rate. So this is something we monitor very closely every year because we are in competition with other communities for attracting businesses, and the tax load is one of the factors that businesses consider. I would say that we have succeeded in ensuring that our current commercial tax structure is competitive with those communities with whom we compete for business. I realize that I used compete and competitive excessively in that paragraph, but the thesaurus didn't help me much in this particular instance. Okay, so this next slide, I think that vividly describes what we have touched upon previously as to the positive impact of commercial development here in town. When we talk about value, many of us would be surprised to know that approximately 60% of the total assessed value in town is residential and 40% is commercial. However, due to the shifting of the tax burden from residential property onto commercial property, these percentages flip so that the commercial property taxpayers contribute 62.3% of the tax dollars that we use to fund the budget. This makes Burlington very unique and in a good way. For comparison's sake, statewide, residential taxpayers contribute on average approximately 82% of the tax levies, while here in Burlington, residents are responsible for about 38%. We are certainly the envy of Massachusetts in this regard. But this is also the reason why we work so hard to cultivate a vibrant business community here in town, as our budget is reliant upon it. This next chart shows the trend in values in levy share over time for the residential and commercial sectors. What I'd like to call your attention to on this is the far left corner. In 2010, commercial value in town was about 35% of the total value, and by 2021, commercial value was up to approximately 39% of the total value. This is a result of a lot of work the town did back during the last economic downturn in 2006 to 2008. Kristen Kasner of the planning department has often said that Burlington has done great work planning for the future when times are tough. I think this chart demonstrates that. This would be the redevelopment that town meeting approved for Third Ave in the district being built out over time. I also think that all the work the town has done the past few years to reposition itself has us poised to capitalize on the future. But it does take a while for us to benefit and capture some of the new tax dollars generated by our economic growth. State aid. As we are all aware, Burlington does not receive a ton of state aid in comparison to similar communities. As we have already discussed on previous slides, we are very rich in terms of property value in town. Many of the formulas that the state uses to distribute state aid include property values as a component, and this works against us. You can also see from the chart that state aid has funded less and less of our budget over time. In 2011, it was approximately 7.5%, and we estimate state aid for this year as funding approximately 6.5%. That said, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Representative Gordon and Senator Friedman for their advocacy for Burlington on Beacon Hill and protecting our state aid over these last two extremely difficult financial years. Even a modest 10% cut to our state aid would have had a drastic impact on our budget situation, and we are extremely thankful for their hard work and dedication to the town. Okay, the next category of revenue for discussion is local receipts. This category of revenue includes a variety of different items that are collected by the community. Some examples are motor vehicle excise taxes, meals tax, hotel tax, building permits, and the like. This is the part of our operation that the pandemic impacted almost immediately. We lost over $6 million worth of local receipts revenue almost overnight from the meals tax, hotel tax, and building permits. As you can see, between 2020 and 2021 is where we made the required budget adjustment at last September's town meeting. This loss of revenue also impacts our ability to replenish our free cash, which as we all know is how we were able to invest in our pay-as-you-go capital program. We added the next slide to drill down on those three big categories of local receipts that have suffered the most. Meals tax overall is down 39%. We are pretty optimistic about this trending back, hopefully the quickest. Building permits are currently down about 50%. We have always budgeted these conservatively, and they have always fluctuated with the economy, but we have some concerns here. Hotel tax is down 68%. This is the one that is most concerning to us at this point. Pre-pandemic, our hotels had a very high occupancy and a lot of business travelers. It's no surprise to any of us given how we have all been able to adapt to these virtual meetings. This revenue source is likely to be impaired for quite some time. This next slide is an illustration of the town's new growth and excess capacity. We are doing quite well in both these categories, but these numbers are very dependent upon economic activity. As you can see, we have had a very nice run over the last 10 years. New growth represents the new tax dollars that are generated by growth in our property values. This would include anything from a deck on your house to a new restaurant or office building. Excess capacity represents where we stand in terms of Proposition 2.5 spending limits. We are proud to say we are one of the few communities in Massachusetts to annually tax well below what we would be allowed to under Proposition 2.5. To put this in perspective, in 2021, we could have spent and taxed an additional $12.5 million without a tax override. I am very proud of the discipline that everybody involved in the budget process has shown to work hard to minimize tax increases on our residents and our businesses. The credit for this belongs to our elected officials, the Ways and Means Committee, our department heads, and the school administration, who work very hard to craft a budget that identifies what we need and not necessarily what we want. Our budget goals have been fairly consistent over time. Maintain level service where possible. I can't say that we were able to meet that goal this year, but I am hopeful that we got as close as we could given the circumstances. We always want to control fees. No new fees are contemplated in this budget. The town's philosophy has been to accommodate as much as we can under the property tax. A plan for backing off the use of reserves. This is a new goal for us. We did not contemplate reserves for operating budget this year. This could come into play with the federal ARPA plan, which I will touch on a little bit at the end. We always want to prioritize our investment in infrastructure. Our investment continues. Our public works facility is going according to plan. The MWRA project is advancing ahead of schedule. And you may have heard the good news that the school department has begun the process of replacing the Fox Hill School. When this project comes online, we will be able to accommodate it without impacting operations and without a tax override due to the long-term planning we have done with our debt plan and monitoring. We also like to adjust plans for our long-term liabilities. As it relates to our OPEB funding, we worked hard with the Ways and Means Committee to replace the payment that we had foregone last year in order to keep our funding plan on track. As we head into town meeting, we wanted you to have the updated balances for our key reserves. The free cash balance reflects what we will close the year with if you were to approve the warrant as it is proposed. We haven't had to access our stabilization funds recently, and it currently sits at a little over $10 million. Excess levy capacity is an assumption based upon the budget and financial articles being passed as proposed. We anticipate that we could possibly erode a little bit of excess capacity with this budget, but we won't know for sure until our assessors have a number for us as to what the new tax growth in the community has been over the past year. Concerns and considerations for fiscal year 22. The first item of note is ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, as proposed by the federal government. John Denizio and I have sat through at least 10 seminars on ARPA, all of which has said we don't know what the details are, but they will be released on or about May 10th, which is, of course, too late to have any impact for us at our town meeting on May 10th. We are optimistic that ARPA will have some funding that will have a positive impact on our town. We are not sure if it will impact our budget or our capital plan, but over the summer, we will be determining how to best utilize what aspects we can and hopefully return to you at the September town meeting with an update. The school department, likewise, will be reviewing rescue funds available for education to determine how to best utilize those going forward. As we've talked about on several different areas throughout this presentation, local receipts are a huge area of concern for us going forward. We have made the appropriate adjustment to the operating budget, but the other aspect is that we rely on local receipt surpluses to replenish our free cash that we use our free cash to fund our capital plan. So that leads to the next consideration, which is monitoring our reserves. We will really have to monitor our reserve position over the next few years as local receipts hopefully rebound. We may not have the ability to fund as much pay-as-you-go capital as we like to over the past few years. Free cash most likely will not replenish as quickly, so we will need to make our reserves stretch a little bit farther than usual. And lastly, and just as a heads up, we may need to make further adjustments to this budget in September. We are hopeful that this budget, if approved in May, will be sustainable, but further reductions in revenue remain a possibility. We will also have a better understanding of ARPA and have our fingers crossed to hopefully impact the budget in positive ways at our September meeting. That's the end of the budget overview. There are so many people involved in the preparation of this budget, so please bear with me as I express my gratitude. Special thank you to Whitney Haskell and John Denizio, as I really couldn't do this without them. Thank you to the Select Board and all of our elected boards and committees for all of their input along the way. I'd like to thank all of our department heads, Superintendent Conti and the school administration for their cooperation and teamwork to help us put this together. And lastly, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our Ways and Means and Capital Committees. They have invested hundreds of hours in reviewing these financial items, and they do so with a very high level of professionalism and courtesy throughout the process. Thank you very much for your time, and we very respectfully request your support as the budget as it's presented to you this evening. Thank you.